Have you ever put on something you made and thought, something about this just looks kind of homemade? Maybe you couldn't quite put your finger on why. Chances are it was one of these 5 things I'm going to share today. Not only that, but you'll learn the super simple ways you can fix them and create clothing that looks polished and lovely. The first sign of clothing that looks homemade rather than handmade is stiff, bulky facings. Lucky for you, this is a super easy fix. I'm going to show you how to make your facings look much more professional. But before I get to that, just a quick word on what I mean by homemade. I do not want to suggest there's anything wrong with homemade clothing. I also don't think the clothes you make have to be perfect for you to enjoy them, because sewing should be a place to play and have fun, and perfectionism is the enemy of fun. But sometimes you just notice that something seems a bit off and you don't know why. Personally, my goal is not for my clothing to look store-bought necessarily, but to give it the attention to detail that it really deserves. I think of it as handmade rather than homemade. Okay, back to the first sign, those stiff, bulky facings that I mentioned. You might notice that your necklines and armholes look oddly stiff compared to other clothing you have. The culprit is your inner facing. When I first started sewing, I would always use the same kind of inner facing, a cheap, non-woven fusible that was available at the big box fabric store. But I never liked how it looked, and for a while, I just thought the clothing I made would always look a little worse than the clothing I could buy. Actually, it's a super easy thing to fix once you know a bit about interfacing. Let me give you a quick rundown and some pointers to find the right one for your next project. There are 4 main types of interfacing: woven interfacing, non-woven interfacing, knit interfacing, and weft interfacing. Woven interfacing is made just like woven fabric. That means it has a grain and it needs to be cut in a specific direction, just like your fabric. It's great for more medium or heavyweight fabrics. Next is non-woven. This one doesn't have a grain line because it's made by bonding or felting fibers together. That means you can cut it in any direction, but it also doesn't last as long over time if you wash it. I like to use it for more crafty projects personally. And then there's knit interfacing. Knit interfacing is just a little bit of stretch, so you can use it with knit fabric, but it's also great for wovens. Because it's so light and pliable, I love to use it with light or drapey fabrics. It's actually my go-to for most clothing projects. And finally, there is weft interfacing. This is a knit interfacing that has fibers woven throughout which prevent it from stretching. It's a lot like knit interfacing, just without the extra stretch. You can find all of these as fusible interfacings that bond right to your fabric with the iron. But you can also find specialty sew-in interfacings of all kinds. You can even use light, crisp fabrics that you already have as interfacing, like organza or a light cotton. So how do you choose the right interfacing? Not only do you have all these different types, but they come in different weights. You've got everything from heavyweight woven interfacings to super light knit interfacing. Let me tell you what I do. I like to create a little stash of a few different types of interfacing, so I have them on hand when I need them. Then I can try holding them with swatches of my fabric to see what they'll look like together. I always have lightweight knit interfacing, a light to medium weft interfacing, and a light and medium woven interfacing. I find that I rarely need a heavier interfacing, but if I do, I'll buy it for a specific project. Usually, you'll want to choose an interfacing that's either a similar weight to your fabric or a little bit lighter. Take a look at this garment. It uses a lightweight fabric, so it has a lightweight interfacing that allows it to drape. This one is a bit crisper. We used a medium weight interfacing for extra body. See the difference? So here's the bottom line with interfacing. Don't just go for the cheap non-woven stuff that's meant for all craft projects. Collect a few different types and weights, then match the weight to your project. And just between you and me, I use lightweight knit interfacing. And just between you and me, I use lightweight knit interfacing on at least 80% of my projects, so it's a good standby if you can't decide. Those pesky facings that keep rolling to the outside of your garment can instantly make your handmade clothes look kind of wonky. You know what I mean? They pop out of necklines, they refuse to stay put in armholes, and they make your edges look messy. But here's the thing. Your store-bought clothes don't have this problem, and your handmade clothes don't need to either. I'm going to show you 4 techniques that will transform how your facings behave. Let's start with the most important technique, understitching. Now, you might have seen this in your pattern instructions and wondered if you could skip it. I get it. When I was learning to sew, I thought the same thing. But this simple step is actually the secret weapon of professional-looking facings. Here's how understitching works. After you've sewn your facing in place, you'll press the seam allowance towards the facing piece. This is really important. You want that seam allowance going in the right direction. Then you're going to stitch through both the facing and the seam allowance about 1/8 to 1/4 inch away from the seam. Let me show you the difference. Here's a facing I've understitched. Notice how it sits perfectly flat against the inside of the garment? And here's one without understitching. See how it wants to roll to the outside? That's exactly what we're trying to prevent. The best part about understitching is that it's completely invisible from the outside of your garment. You get all the benefit of that professional finish without anyone seeing the extra stitching. Now let's talk about our second technique, edge stitching. Sometimes you might run into situations where understitching isn't possible, or maybe you're working with a fabric that's just being stubborn. This is where edge stitching comes in handy. Edge stitching is exactly what it sounds like. You're stitching right along the edge, very close to the seam. Unlike understitching, this will show on the outside of your garment, but can actually become a beautiful design detail. I especially love using this technique when I'm working with bulky fabrics that need extra control, synthetic materials that resist pressing, and areas where understitching just isn't possible. One thing I've learned from years of sewing is that edge stitching can also add a really nice tailored look to your garment. It's like adding that extra level of polish that you often see in high-end ready-to-wear clothing. Our third technique is what I call the insurance policy for facings, tacking. This is such a simple step, but it makes a huge difference in how your garment wears over time. All you're doing is securing your facing to the inside of your garment with a few strategic stitches. Let me show you exactly where to place these tacks. If you're working with a neckline facing, you'll want to secure it at the shoulder seams. For armhole facings, I like to tack them at the underarm seam as well as at the shoulder. The key is to catch just a few threads of your main fabric so the stitches are practically invisible from the outside. The fourth technique is top stitching your facing. Once you've pressed it in place, you can top stitch all around the lower edge to really hold it where you want. Now, this top stitching will be highly visible, so treat it as a design detail and decide if that's the look you want. You might be wondering if you need to use all 4 techniques on every project. The answer is no, but I often use 2 of these methods together. I'll use either understitching or edge stitching to prevent rolling, and either tacking or top stitching to keep it from flopping around. Think of it like a belt and suspenders approach. You're giving your facings multiple reasons to stay exactly where they belong. Next, let's talk about something that really baffled me when I was a beginner: how to make the inside of my garments look good and last. Whenever I bought clothes at the store, they had these really professional looking stitched finishes on the inside that enclosed the raw edges, and it prevented everything from unraveling. But the clothes I was making had all these loose threads from the raw edges where the fabric had been cut, and I really didn't know what to do about it. Later, I learned that those neat edges in store-bought clothing come from a serger, a really nifty piece of equipment that I now own and use to finish almost every seam allowance. We have a great video on learning to use a serger that I'll link below if you're thinking about getting one. But even if you don't have a serger, you can absolutely get a professional looking finish inside your clothing. Here's something that might surprise you. Sergers weren't even common in clothing manufacturing until the 1970s. So think about that for a second. All those gorgeous vintage pieces from the 50s and 60s, they didn't have serged edges. And yet when you look inside those garments, they're often beautifully finished. So how did they do it? They used several different techniques that you can easily learn. French seams, for instance, completely enclose the raw edges between 2 rows of stitching. It's like magic. You can't see any raw edges at all. Flat felled seams, which you might recognize from the sides of your jeans, are another option that creates an incredibly strong, clean finish. Even something as simple as pinking, using those zigzag scissors you might have seen, can work really well on certain fabrics. The key is matching your seam finish to your fabric and your pattern. You wouldn't use a bulky flat felled seam on delicate silk, just like you wouldn't use a basic pinked edge on a heavyweight wool coat. Let me walk you through how to choose the right finish for your project. First, consider your fabric weight. Lightweight fabrics like silk or cotton lawn work beautifully with French seams because they don't create bulk. Medium weight fabrics like quilting cotton or linen can handle almost any finish, including basic turned and stitched edges or a Hong Kong binding. For heavier fabrics like denim or wool, you might want to consider flat felled seams or a simple zigzag stitch along the edge. The zigzag prevents fraying while adding minimal bulk, perfect for those thick fabrics that already have enough body of their own. Now let's talk about when to plan your seam finishes. This is crucial. You need to decide on your seam finish before you start sewing. Some techniques like French seams require specific seam allowances and construction order. I learned this the hard way when I tried to add French seams to a nearly finished blouse and I had to completely take it apart. Here's a tip I wish I'd known as a beginner. Test your chosen finish on scraps first. Different fabrics can behave unexpectedly, and what works perfectly on one might be a disaster on another. I once tried to use a turned and stitched finish on a lightweight rayon, and it created such an obvious ridge that you could see them from the right side of the garment. When you're testing, check for 3 things. First, does the finish actually contain the raw edges and prevent fraying? Second, is it creating too much bulk? And third, can you see it from the right side of the garment? If the answer to any of these is problematic, try a different finish. One of my favorite techniques for lightweight to medium weight fabric is the turned finish. It's simple but effective. You simply press under the raw edge about 1/4 inch, then stitch close to the fold and trim away the excess. It's like a tiny hem. This works especially well on straight or slightly curved seams, and it's perfect for beginners because it's so straightforward. For curved seams like armholes or necklines, Bias binding is your friend. You can buy pre-made binding or make your own. Making your own gives you more control over the look and feel of your garment. I love using self-fabric bias binding because it creates such a cohesive look inside the garment. Let's talk about one of the biggest mistakes I see sewists make. And I made this mistake myself for years. When I first started sewing, I was like a kid in a candy store. I'd walk into fabric stores and be absolutely mesmerized by all those beautiful quilting cottons. The prints, the colors, I just wanted to use them for everything. Here's the thing about quilting cotton though. While it's perfect for quilts, it's made from what we call short staple cotton. Now you're probably thinking, but cotton is cotton, right? Actually, the length of the cotton fiber makes a huge difference in how the fabric behaves when you wear it. Let me show you what I mean. See how this quilting cotton stands away from the body? It's quite stiff, even after washing. I used to tell myself it would soften up over time, but here's what I learned. Because of the actual structure of those short cotton fibers, it's never really going to get soft. Now, I will say that quilting cottons have improved a lot over the years. Some manufacturers are making softer versions that work better for clothing, but you still need to be really selective, and here's how. First, let's talk about what most clothing actually needs. 1, drape and fluidity for things like flowy dresses or soft blouses. 2, heft for structured garments like tailored jackets. 3, crispness for certain details like collars or cuffs. Here's my favorite trick for choosing the right fabric. I call it the drape test. Take your fabric and drape it around your body or on a dress form. Now, imagine it in the shape of your planned garment. Ask yourself, does it fall naturally around the body? Does it create the silhouette you're looking for? Are you fighting with the fabric to make it behave? Let me show you some examples of good fabric choices for different garments. For a flowing summer dress, light cotton lawn, rayon challis, silk crepe de chine. For a structured blazer, wool suiting, medium weight linen, cotton twill. Here's another pro tip that took me years to learn. Natural fibers are your best friends when you're developing your sewing skills. Here's why. They press beautifully for crisp seams. They're more forgiving when you make mistakes, and they're easier to control under your presser foot. This doesn't mean you can never use synthetics. There are some beautiful polyester fabrics out there, but if you're struggling with getting professional results, stick with natural fibers like cotton, linen, wool, or silk. Let me show you a quick comparison of how different fabrics handle pressing. See how this cotton takes a clean, sharp press? Now watch what happens with this polyester. It's much more resistant to holding that crisp edge. One question I get all the time is, but what if my pattern doesn't specify fabric types? So here's my foolproof method. 1, look at the line drawings. 2, notice the way the garment is supposed to hang. 3, check if there are any structural elements. 4, consider how fitted it is. 5, think about seasonal wear. And remember those recommended fabrics on your pattern envelope? They're not just suggestions, they're really valuable guidelines based on how the pattern was designed and tested. Start there, and as you gain experience, you can begin to experiment with different options. Now let's talk about the number 1 thing that makes clothing look not quite so polished. It's probably not what you think. If you've ever had bubbling seams, puckered edges, or just felt like your garments looked a bit amateur, then we need to talk about pressing. Now, I know what you're thinking. Pressing is boring, it takes too much time, and you'd rather just keep sewing. We've all been there. When I first started sewing, I used to skip pressing all the time because I didn't want to keep getting up from my machine. But here's what I discovered. Pressing is just as crucial as your stitching for creating professional looking clothes. In fact, it's the number 1 thing you can do to make your clothes look better. First, let's clear up a common misconception. Pressing and ironing are actually 2 different techniques. When you iron, you're moving the iron back and forth across the fabric. But pressing is more like stamping. You're lifting and lowering the iron in an up and down motion. This difference might seem small, but it's actually huge for getting professional results. Here's my tried and true pressing method that I use on every single garment. Step 1, press the seam as sewn. Right after you sew a seam, press it exactly as it came off your machine. This step sets the stitches into the fabric. Step 2, open and press again. Now comes the magic. Open up your seam and press the seam allowances. Your pattern will tell you whether to press them open or to one side. If you're pressing them open, use the tip of your iron to really get into that seam line. If you're pressing to one side, make sure you're pressing in the direction specified by your pattern. Let's talk about some common pressing problems I see. Bubbling seams. This usually happens when you try to press intersecting seams in the wrong order. Always press the first seam before sewing and pressing the second one. This prevents those annoying bubbles that can make your garment look homemade. Shine marks. If you're working with delicate fabrics, use a pressing cloth to prevent marks. You can buy one, but I often just use a piece of cotton muslin. Hard to reach areas. Those tiny corners and curved seams can be really tricky to press. This is where pressing tools come in handy. A tailor's ham is perfect for pressing curved seams, while a point presser helps you get into those tight corners. I also prefer an iron that has a really pointy tip for that reason. It's just easier to get into all those tight spots. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. I'm a busy human, I don't have time to press every single seam. Here's my time-saving hack that doesn't compromise quality. Batch your pressing. If you're sewing several seams that don't intersect, you can sew them all and then press them together. This means fewer trips between your sewing machine and your ironing board. However, and this is important, if you're working with seams that intersect, you must press the first seam before sewing the second one. There's no way around this if you want professional results. And if you really want to get the perfectly smooth seams you see on high-end clothing, you need to learn to use the right pressing tools. Watch this video next to learn about some inexpensive tools that'll make it easy to get into tight spaces, prevent fabric damage, and make your handmade clothing look chef's kiss.